Someone posts a photo. Within seconds, they're checking the likes, refreshing, counting. 100 feels like failure when their friend got 300. They delete it. Try again tomorrow with better lighting. This isn't vanity. It's survival math in a world where your social worth is quantified in real time, publicly, by everyone you know. Gen Z isn't soft. They're not entitled or lazy or addicted to their phones in some moral failure kind of way. They're optimized for a world that older generations didn't grow up inside. Same human brain, same psychological needs, completely different environments shaping the defaults. And until you understand what that environment actually trained into them, every conversation across the generational divide turns into an argument nobody wins. This video breaks down the 3 psychological imprints that shaped Gen Z, born roughly 1997 and after, and why those imprints create such specific friction with parents, bosses, and older coworkers who can't figure out why this generation seems to operate on different rules. There's a quick test near the middle to identify which imprint shaped you most, because even if you're not Gen Z, some of these patterns might sound uncomfortably familiar. Here's the framing before we dive in. This isn't about stereotyping an entire generation. It's about patterns, the shared environments, technologies, and pressures that shaped default settings. Not every Gen Z person fits all 3 imprints, but enough do that the patterns are worth understanding. Let's start with imprint 1 because this one gets mislabeled as narcissism when it's actually something more complicated. Imprint 1 is the algorithmic mirror. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up with social media, not as a novelty, but as the baseline architecture of social life. From middle school onward, their social world has been quantified. Likes, followers, comments, shares, every interaction measured, ranked, displayed. The comparison isn't abstract. It's numerical. You know exactly where you stand relative to your peers because the platform tells you in real time. This environment trained a specific instinct, constant reputation monitoring. When you grow up under perpetual audience pressure, your nervous system becomes a reputation radar. You're scanning for how you're perceived before you've even finished the thought. Cringe detection develops early. Hypocrisy detection sharpens. Authenticity becomes currency because performed authenticity gets called out instantly by peers who've developed the same radar. Here's how this shows up. Hyper-awareness of personal brand, even outside professional contexts. Sensitivity to being seen as fake or trying too hard. Preference for creators and public figures who seem real over polished and corporate. Quick pattern recognition for when someone's performing versus being genuine. This isn't superficiality. It's sophisticated social navigation in an environment where reputation damage spreads faster than it ever has in human history. The tension emerges when older generations, who built identity in slower and more private contexts, interpret this awareness as insecurity or self-obsession. But growing up with a permanent public record changes the stakes. One bad moment can follow you forever. One screenshot circulates beyond your control. The vigilance isn't paranoia. It's a rational response to an environment where social consequences are immediate, visible, and archived. There's another layer here worth understanding. Social media didn't just create comparison. It created constant comparison to curated highlights. Everyone's feed is a greatest hits album. Gen Z knows this intellectually. They know the photos are filtered, the moments are staged, the success is selective. But knowing doesn't stop the feeling. The comparison happens faster than the rational correction. That's what living inside the algorithmic mirror actually does to a developing brain. When you grow up under constant audience pressure, your nervous system calibrates accordingly. That's not weakness, that's adaptation. Imprint 2 is uncertainty as the baseline. Gen Z entered adolescence and early adulthood surrounded by instability narratives. Economic anxiety after 2008. Climate projections that feel more like countdowns than distant warnings. A pandemic that erased the transition from teenager to adult for millions. School shootings normalized to the point of drill routines. Political polarization that makes the future feel less like a path and more like a question mark. This environment trained a specific relationship with security. Don't trust the old playbooks. The work hard, stay loyal, climb the ladder formula that worked for boomers doesn't compute when companies lay off thousands while posting record profits. The buy a house, build equity, retire comfortably path doesn't compute when housing prices outpace wages by multiples. Gen Z watched millennials do everything right and still struggle. They learned the lesson early. Here's how this shows up. Job switching that older generations call disloyal, but Gen Z sees as building options. Prioritizing well-being and mental health over grinding through misery for a future payoff that might not arrive. Skepticism toward pay your dues. Rhetoric when the dues keep increasing and the payoff keeps shrinking. high anxiety about falling behind, paired paradoxically with rejection of the traditional metrics of getting ahead. The tension is predictable. When boomers or Gen X see someone leave a job after 18 months for better conditions, they might read it as flakiness or lack of commitment. Gen Z reads it as rational portfolio management in an unreliable market. Neither interpretation is wrong, they're just calibrated to different environments. One generation learned that loyalty gets rewarded, the other learned that loyalty gets exploited. For Gen Z, flexibility isn't flakiness, it's a safety plan in a world that stopped guaranteeing safety. Before Imprint 3, let's make this concrete. Quick test. Answer honestly. First, do you feel pressure to be seen, liked, or validated, especially online? Does your mood shift based on how content performs or how you're perceived? That's Imprint 1 running. Second, do you prioritize well-being and options over traditional status ladders? Does the grind now, enjoy later philosophy feel like a bad deal rather than wisdom? That's Imprint 2. Third, do you use mental health and boundary language naturally? Do concepts like protect my peace or that's not good for my mental health feel like normal vocabulary rather than therapy jargon? That's Imprint 3. Whichever resonated most reveals the imprint that shaped you most. And Imprint 3 is the one that creates the most friction with older generations because it sounds like a completely different language. Imprint 3 is emotional, literacy as the default. Gen Z grew up in an era where mental health moved from stigmatized to mainstream. Therapy language entered everyday conversation. Anxiety, depression, and trauma became speakable rather than shameful. Boundaries stopped being a clinical concept and became a social norm. This shift happened fast. Within a single generation, the vocabulary for inner experience transformed completely. This environment trained a specific capacity, naming emotions rather than suppressing them. Where boomers learned control your feelings and Gen X learned deal with it privately, Gen Z learned identify it, name it, communicate it. This isn't fragility. It's a different coping architecture. Both approaches serve the same goal, managing difficult emotions through opposite strategies. Here's how this shows up. Comfort saying, I need space, or that triggered me, without embarrassment. Lower tolerance for toxic dynamics in workplaces, families, or relationships. Expectation that mental health needs will be accommodated, not hidden. The phrase, protect my peace as a legitimate boundary rather than an excuse. The tension is immediate. Older generations hear boundaries and sometimes translate it as disrespect. They hear, I need a mental health day, and wonder why this generation can't push through like they did. The vocabulary itself creates friction. What Gen Z considers healthy communication can sound to older ears like weakness, excuse-making, or self-indulgence. But here's the reframe. Older generations learned to control emotions because expressing them was dangerous. It cost jobs, relationships, respect. Gen Z learned to name emotions because suppressing them was dangerous. It cost mental health, authenticity, connection. Both are survival strategies shaped by different consequences. Neither is universally right. They're just calibrated to different risks. There's a cost to both approaches. Suppression builds resilience but can create disconnection and unprocessed pain. Expression builds awareness but can create oversensitivity and difficulty tolerating discomfort. Gen Z is navigating the downsides of their approach, just like boomers navigated theirs. The packaging is different. The human struggle underneath is the same. Older generations learned control emotions. Gen Z learned name emotions. Both are coping styles trained by the environment that felt safest at the time. So how do you actually communicate across these imprints? 3 translation rules. First, lead with curiosity rather than judgment. Gen Z's cringe radar is finely tuned. They detect condescension instantly. When you open with, your generation just doesn't understand hard work, the conversation ends before it starts. Try instead, help me understand your logic here. Or, what's your thinking on this? You're not agreeing with them. You're signaling that their perspective has value, which keeps the channel open. Second, frame stability as options rather than loyalty. Gen Z doesn't trust institutions to reward loyalty, so pay your dues rhetoric lands as naive rather than wise. Reframe advice in terms of building leverage. This experience gives you more options later works better than stick it out and you'll be rewarded. You're speaking to their actual value system instead of fighting it. Third, ask about experience rather than demanding defense. Instead of, why does your generation need so many mental health days? Try, what does stress look like for you compared to when I was your age? Questions that invite sharing rather than justification produce actual conversation. You might learn something. They might feel heard. Both outcomes beat another argument that goes nowhere. Here's what I need you to understand about generational differences. The labels are imperfect. Age effects, era effects, and cohort effects overlap messily. Not every Gen Z person matches these patterns. Not every boomer fits the imprints from the previous video. But patterns exist because environments shape defaults, and defaults shape friction points. Understanding doesn't mean agreeing. You don't have to think Gen Z has it all figured out. But seeing where their instincts come from can lower the temperature on conversations that currently generate more heat than light. You stop interpreting their choices as character flaws and start seeing them as adaptations to conditions you didn't face at their age. That shift won't bridge every gap. Some differences are too real to dissolve with empathy alone. But for most relationships, understanding the wiring reduces the resentment. You stop taking their choices personally. They stop feeling judged for existing. And somewhere in that space, actual connection becomes possible. So, tell me, which imprint shaped you most? Did this reframe how you see your own generation or someone else's? Drop it in the comments. I want to know which part clicked. If this helped you understand a generational conflict in your life, subscribe. We break down the psychology behind everyday patterns in a way that actually makes sense. The next video takes a sharp turn. The psychology of people who don't care about the Winter Olympics. Because the same instincts that shape how generations engage with work and relationships also shape what captures attention and what doesn't. Why do some people obsess over events like this while others feel nothing? That one explains more than you'd expect. I'll see you there.